Good evening. This is the second class of the Proverbs class, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes class. It is Thursday night, December the 14th. And we are beginning our class tonight by, again, discussing the idea that I brought out just a little bit last week about the idea of literary forms when we talk about the book of Proverbs. Last week, and I want to thank Joe Byrne for sending me the great notes that he did. It kind of helps jog my memory about what I needed to be talking about, where I needed to go from there. But the bottom line is we talked very briefly last week about Proverbs and the various forms or the classifications. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in just a few moments. But what we wanted to key in on was the idea of chiasmus. One of the things that and the more I study this, the more I come to the realization that there is something to be said about this, is the fact that when you look at a lot of the old literature, the Greek, the Hebrew, and things along that line, they did not have a lot of paper. They did not have paper like we have it today. They had papyrus. They would write on skins. They would write on scrolls made of animal skins, things along that line. And as a result of that, they would try to the very best of their ability to be very conservative when it comes to how they wrote things out. Hey, brother, glad to have you here. Glad to have you here tonight. I just started the class a couple of moments ago talking about the idea of literary forms in the book of Proverbs, and we're going to go on from there. As I was saying, in the time of the Hebrews as well as the Greeks, there wasn't a lot. You couldn't go down to the local office supply store and pick up packs of paper. You would have to make paper out of papyrus. You would have to make paper or something like that. You would have to make skins. And with the skins, you would then write on the skins. And you also, because it was such a precious commodity, you would not waste any room whatsoever in it. So they would not break for paragraphs. They would not break for what we call sentences. They didn't, in a lot of situations, they did not even put in the simple things such as commas, periods, and things along that line, because the material was so sparse. So another thing that we also know that is true at that particular time is the fact that they pretty well demanded, or they wanted something that would make it easy to remember. And so as we look especially at the Proverbs, and as I pointed out last week, Thomas Campbell had required all of his children to memorize the entire book of Proverbs. It would need to be done in such a way to where it would be easy to memorize. Now, there's different ways to do that. And as I said a few moments ago, we're going to talk about those ways when we go down through there just a little bit further. But one of the ways they did it was by the method called chiasmus. Chiasmus was a literary event that they used back then that we're not that familiar with. So chiasmus is kind of like this. And here you have one from Matthew, the 7th chapter, passage we're very familiar with. No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. So, and what they have found is more and more and more of this in scriptures and things along this line. Now, here's how it breaks down. So let's take these clauses one at a time. No man can serve two masters. Well, there's the main point that he's trying to get at, all right? And as we keep going down through here, you look at the clause and see how it breaks down. No man can serve two masters. And here's the second clause, which is, what do we say? Subservient to this clause. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Now, here's the thing I want you to notice. And again, maybe drawing it out this way, you can see it. This A here and this other A here, they're saying the same thing. No man can serve two masters. You cannot serve God and mammon. It's the very same phrase, but again, it would be a way that you could help you to memorize it. What is the main point? You can't serve two masters. You can't serve God and mammon. Notice B, for either he will hate the one, and then go down here, this B part, and despise the other. So again, is that not, as you're looking at it, for either he will hate the one and despise the other, is that not saying in essence the same thing? Absolutely. And then, according to what many scholars seem to think, you have this middle section here, which in many cases would be the main point. Okay? So, as Jesus is saying this, no man can serve two masters, for either hate the one or love the other. And love the other is a sinner, or else he will be devoted. Now, this is out of the New American Standard Bible, so just want you to know where that particular quote's from. But you see this idea of loving the other and devoted to the to one are saying the same thing, and that's the main point. So, this is the way they would do this. And we could give you let me give you some other examples of chiasmus from Scripture. And again, when we go into this in more detail, we will look at this a little bit more. Turn to John 13:36 through 14:4. John 13:36 to John 14:4. Now, you see somewhat of a chiastic idea here in John 13 and 14. Now, remember the context. Jesus is talking to his disciples and trying to remind them concerning these things and about the fact that the Spirit was going to come and so forth. And we begin in verse 36. Peter said to him, Lord, where are you going? Now, this was after Jesus had said the Son is going to be glorified. He said, where are you going? Where I'm going, you cannot follow me now, but you shall follow me afterward. Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for your sake. Will you lay down your life for my sake? Most assuredly I say to you, the rooster shall not crow till you have denied me 3 times. Now going on to 14. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am there you may be also. And where I go, you know, and the way you know. Now, let's just take a few minutes and work through this one a little bit. All right? This is going to be a little bit more intense. This is going to be a little bit more detailed. But again, it gets across the idea that what we're looking at here is a literary pattern that helped them to memorize things. So the first part, here it is. All righty? Simon says what? All right. Simon says,
What verse again, John?
all right, John 13:36. Simon says, Lord, where are you going? See that? Now, jump down, if you would, to chapter 14, verse 4. And where I go, you know, and the way, you know. Lord, where are you going? Well, we're going to come back down here in just a moment before it's all said and done. And we're going to see this other thing brought up again. And I'm using this little apostrophe thing to emphasize the idea that this is the antithesis, or this is connecting together with the other one. Okay? So, he says this in John 14:4. You know where I go. You know where I go and the way you know. All right, so there's, Lord, where are you going? And Jesus is going to say, you know where I'm going. And you know how to get there. Now, let's go on a little further. And then Peter says what? Lord? Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. All right, that's 13:37. And Jesus said, will you lay down your life for me? Now you see how it's building upon one another, Lord, where are you going? Why can't I follow you now? Then there was this clause, I will lay down my life for you. And then he says, will you lay down your life for me? Rooster will not crow, or a rooster will not crow until you deny me 3 times. All right, now I'm not going to write all that out. Whatever I put rooster 3 times, you know what I'm talking about. All right, now. Then what's the next thing Jesus said? Here is the center. Here is the key. Here's what Jesus is trying to get across. Do not let your heart be troubled. Believe in God and me, right? Now that's the key that he's really wanting them to understand. Of course, he's writing here specifically to Peter, or not writing, but talking specifically to Peter here. But that's the main thing he's wanting them to get. So now what? Will you lay down your life for me? And then he says what right after that? In my Father's house are many mansions or dwelling places, right? One person says, is there mansions there or are there just rooms there? You know what? This boy right here doesn't care as long as he gets there. That's something there. So in the Father's house are many mansions or dwelling places. I would have told you, if not so, I would have told you, right? I go to do what? I go to prepare a place. For you. All right, now, then what? B, if I go and prepare a place, maybe. If I go and prepare a place, I will come again and receive you unto myself. And here's the key. That where I am, you may what? You may be also. So, now let's look at this for a minute. All right. Lord, why can't I follow you now? I'll lay down my life for you. Jesus said, I go and prepare a place for you. I will come where I am. There you may be also. Lord, where are you going? You know where I go. So you see, even in this, you see this chiastic structure. And again, it was a way that they do this a lot of times. Now, some people, I think, do get carried away with it. One, I was doing some more research in the Society for Biblical Literature, and there was one guy that actually tried to work out Homer's Iliad, which is this huge, massive book, and thinks that the whole thing is a chiastic structure. So the bottom line is you should see this a lot of times in the Bible. And again, this is just one of the ways that would help people to memorize. It was a mnemonic device to help them to memorize what the Bible said so that they could be able to remember it in a time when you couldn't go down to the local bookstore and buy a Bible for $1 or something like that. They had to have a way to do this, and this was the way to do it. And again, this idea of memorization, they would memorize much more than we do today. I think one of the things that have hurt us, specifically in our culture today, is the fact that sometimes we don't memorize enough. And part of that reason is we always sit back and say, well, I got my phone on me, I've got my internet, I've got something else on me. I don't need to memorize it. I've always got it with me. But what did the psalmist say in Psalms 119? Your word have I hid in my heart, that I might not sin against you. Now, again, it's one of those interesting things. You go through the Psalms, you will find this pattern in a lot of the Psalms. You will find this pattern and we just given you 2 examples from John 13, Matthew chapter 5, And again, I could give you even more examples on top of that. Maybe that might be something you could do. Mark 2:27. Mark 2, this is a simple one. Mark 2:27. All right, Mark 2:27. All right, Jerome, you want to take this one and see how you could work out a chiastic scripture here? This is simple. This is really simple. This is going to be an A, B, B, A structure. A, B, B, A. Now let's look at it. Read Mark 2:27.
It says, and he said unto them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man.
Sabbath for man, right? Not man for Sabbath, right? See how simple that is? Sabbath, Sabbath, for man, not for man. Now, what's he doing here? He's trying to draw the contrast with what he says up here. Now, as I said, we're going to see this a lot in Proverbs. Proverbs are going to have different kinds of patterns. I talked very quickly last week about the idea of synonymous parallelism and antithetical parallelism. You remember that? Talk to me.
Well, synonymous means same.
Right. They're saying the same thing in different words. Antithetical means what? They will say one thing and then give the contrast to it. All right. So with those things in mind, that's kind of where we're trying to go tonight and seeing some patterns as we go through the Proverbs. And again, there's so much more that we could talk about. But again, we've only got 13 weeks and try to cover as much of this material as we possibly can. So just continue to bear with us in this. All righty. Now, last week and the last time we was talking, and again, I wanted to bring out this idea of chiasma very quickly because I did mention it. We talked about the canonicity of the book. Now, what do we mean by canonicity?
The authenticity of it. Right,
and how it actually, how we know that it belongs in the sacred scriptures, right?
Well,
so,
something are we familiar with to use? It was written.
Right.
And it was something that they weren't aware of. It wasn't something new that somebody just dropped off. Right.
And we spent a little bit of time talking about how some books today, and especially, the History Channel around Christmas and Easter, we'll spend a lot of time talking about how some books didn't make it in the Bible and some books did. And their argument is that the Bible, first off, is a man-made book to begin with. And some of the most important, or some of the things that they consider to be important, got left out because the Roman Catholic Church said, no, that doesn't go with doctrine, therefore it didn't get into the Bible. We know and we believe that it is the Bible, that it's the Word of God. We know that holy men of God spake as they were moved by the Holy Scriptures, 1 Peter chapter 1. We remember that all Scripture is given by inspiration of God, 2 Timothy chapter 3. So we look at it different than they do, but they do attack it that way. Now, how do we know that Proverbs belong there? Well, you said right. It was preserved and it was revered by the Jews because of the connection with Solomon, because of the fact that Solomon was one of the greatest kings, had built the temple at that particular time. Secondly, in the synagogue, I talked very briefly about the idea that Proverbs 26:4-5, answer a fool according to his folly, do not answer a fool according to his folly, that some of them felt like that was a contradiction and that shouldn't be part of the Bible. But again, it's just a matter of how you look at those things. And we even talked about the idea that Josephus emphasized that there was a structure in the book, a structure of the Bible in the first century, 5 books of the law, 13 books of the prophets, and 4 books of hymns to God. So we talked about this. In the church, we know that it was included in what we call the canonicity because Jesus loved the book. We talked about John 3, where to Nicodemus, Jesus revealed the answer to the question posed by Agur in Proverbs chapter 30 at verse 4. Let's look in Proverbs 30 at verse 4.
Another thing, how all of a sudden books get lost?
Do what?
How do all of a sudden get lost?
Well, and again, yeah.
It's like you have a library and you have books that you normally use.
Right.
They just don't get lost.
Uh-huh. Not if you use them a good bit. That's right. That's a very good point. In Proverbs 30 and verse 4, here's the wisdom of Agur. And he said, who has ascended into heaven or descended? Who has gathered the wind in his fist? Who has bound the waters in a garment? Who has established all the ends of the earth? What is his name? And what is his son's name, if you know? Now, there is that passage there in Proverbs chapter 30 at verse 4, who has ascended into heaven or descended. Now, interestingly enough, Jesus will quote this proverb in John chapter 3 in verse 13, where he's talking to Nicodemus. And in this particular passage here, he says, John 3:13, no one has ascended to heaven but he who came down from heaven, that is the Son of Man who is in heaven. So you see the similarities between Proverbs 30 verse 4 and John 3 at verse 13. So again, Jesus would try to use a lot of those proverbs, or some of these proverbs, in his teaching. Some have argued, and this is a very interesting study that you can spend a lot of time with. If you're looking for a term paper, here it is. Some have argued that John's doctrine of logos, in John 1 through 14, in the beginning was the Word, logos, and the Word, logos, was with God, the Word was God. And it goes all the way down to verse 14, and he emphasizes the idea, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory of the only begotten Father. Some of this, according to some people, may be at least in part based on the personification of wisdom in Proverbs chapter 8. Logos, to the Greek mind, was not just the ideal of the word, but what do words do? Words give us thoughts. As I'm talking to you, you can understand what I'm saying. We're sharing thoughts together. And to the Greek mind, that's mainly what it was, to get to truth eventually by sharing thoughts and coming to grips with it. So that ideal of the word. In the Proverbs, the thing that he tries to emphasize is not so much the word as much as what? Wisdom. What is wisdom?
Knowledge used properly. Knowledge
used properly. Well, again, how do we gain knowledge? A lot of times through or by means of words. Mm-hmm. We think things through. I challenge your thinking. You challenge my thinking. We're working together to gain the knowledge that the Bible teaches. And then when we actually, as you said, put it into effect, that's where wisdom comes in. So in the same kind of idea with the word logos, word in the Greek mind, the word wisdom in Proverbs chapter 8 could have that parallel in that respect. So it's interesting to think about that. For example, in Proverbs 8, verse 22, wisdom existed from the beginning. Proverbs chapter 8 at verse 22. All right. And again, let's just look at some of this very quickly. And again, we'll see the point that he's trying to make. Proverbs 8:22 says what? The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way. And here he's talking about wisdom. Verse 12, I, wisdom, deal with prudence. Counsel is mine. Verse 14, I'm understanding. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way, before his works of old. And I have been established from everlasting, from the beginning, before there was ever an earth. So here he's talking about wisdom. And he's saying wisdom was what? It was here before the earth was created. Now, what does it say about Jesus in John 1 verse 1? In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. Now, isn't that interesting that wisdom and logos exist from the beginning? In Proverbs 8 verse 30, when he continues to talk about God creating the world, in fact, verse 22 through 31 is kind of a section there that emphasizes how God created the world. No depths, no fountains abounding with water before the mountains were settled, before the hills. I was brought forth. When he prepared the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he assigned the sea its limit, when he marked out the foundation of the earth, I was beside him as a master craftsman. Okay? So again, here you have this word here, the suggestion here that wisdom was with God when he created the world. Well, of course, we always talk about that. God being all-knowing and God being all-powerful set everything in place, created the heavens and earth, made it to where it works perfectly, set the laws of nature into effect. Now think about the idea again in John 1 at verse 3. John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything that was made. So isn't it interesting that you have wisdom and logos are existing from before the beginning, and then you have wisdom and logos are active in creation. In Proverbs 8 at verse 35, whoever finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord. But he who sins against me wrongs his own soul. All those who hate me love death. And you remember what Jesus says about, or again, John says about Jesus in John 1:4, in him was life, and the life was what? The light of men. So you see the parallels between this ideal of wisdom in Proverbs and the ideal of the Logos in John chapter 1. So the church, as I said, maybe we're stretching it a little bit or pushing it a little bit far. But again, some have argued that part of John's doctrine, and again, we've got to remember that John was writing by inspiration, as was Solomon. So John probably knew the Proverbs very well. And rather than now talking about wisdom, he's now saying, no, Logos, Jesus, he's it. Now, have you ever thought about that from that viewpoint? Have any of us thought about that way? I never did until I was studying this, okay?
Now, repeat that.
What?
What you just said about Jesus?
Jesus being the Logos, wisdom and Logos existing from the beginning. They're both active in creation. Okay. They both give life. They have a life-giving influence. So I don't know if we've ever really thought about it. I know I haven't really thought about it until I was starting to study this. I said, whoa.
Well, the way I was looking at it, I was trying to study it, and what I walked away with, there was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh to give us the Word.
Right, and that's one good way to look at it. But again, think about the word itself and what it meant, and then think about the whole idea of wisdom.
So how do you apply the rainbow word to all this? That's God's unspoken words, utterance, right?
The what now?
The rainbow word.
The rainbow.
Rama.
Oh, Rama. Oh, okay, I know what you're talking about. Again, Logos is different from Rama. Rama, I'll have to do some more studying on it and think about it in that respect. I know there are some people that try to emphasize the difference between Logos and Rama.
Yeah, I don't know if this is correct, but when I would read John 1, in the beginning was the Word. Mm-hmm. And I will look at it as God's Rhema word. But when you look at that word in John 1, it's not Rhema.
It's not Rhema, it's Logos. It's Logos.
And I was looking at it like that, so I'm just looking up and see what this is. Mm-hmm. So, because Rhema means God's utterance.
Right.
So I said,
and Jesus is what? He is not just God's utterance, but he is God. He is man fulfilling exactly what God said. Mm-hmm. So, isn't that interesting? And then you compare that with wisdom. Is wisdom not the same thing?
So Jesus is the Logos, described as the Word. Mm-hmm. And the Word was with God.
Right.
The Word was God. So how do you explain that, though?
Well, the best explanation we can come up with, and again, we have to realize that we don't know, we can't know as finite human beings all that God knows. That gets into the whole discussion of the doctrine of, again, I don't like to use this phrase because it's not a biblical phrase. You don't find it, the word Trinity. But it's more the idea of the Godhead. Now, that's more of a biblical word than either. Yeah. And how do they all fit together? And how does all this work out? Yeah. And how can they all three be separate beings, but what? But all be God at the same time?
Because you can't separate God from his word, but the text doesn't identify the word logos as the utterance, but still a word.
Right.
So it's kind of confusing. Okay, if this is the word, then spoken or unspoken, it's where we're thinking about speech.
Right. We do think about speech, right.
When you identify it as the logos, it's not speech.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have another word for speech or utterance, and that's rhema.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, okay. So I went to look those words up to make sure I wasn't, eisegeting.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's very good to do because, again, you can be careful about that. That's right.
If you just read it in the beginning was the word, you think that's God's utterance, and the word was with God, and the word was God. But all those three words, logos.
Mm-hmm.
All those three words in John 1,
right.
it's logos.
That's right. In fact, through most of John 1, it's logos, not rhema at all.
Yeah.
And so the best explanation I could give, as I said, is Jesus is the actual embodiment of God's word. When you see, when you know what God did and his whole, what it's all about, Jesus is it in every sense of the term. That's why he is the perfect example in all this and how we need to live our lives as well. Going back to here now, there's some 20 quotes from Proverbs found in the New Testament. All right. So the bottom line is it's something that we can and look at more detail, but you might look at some of those passages and see how they were talked about in Proverbs. Proverbs 3, verse 7, Romans 12, verse 16. Proverbs 3:11, Hebrews 12:5. Proverbs 4:6, 1 Peter 5:5. So they're there. You do it. Now, what do we, as you think about a proverb, as we talked about them last week, what is the nature of Proverbs? They're very terse. They're shortest poems, you might say, in the Bible. Okay? One person wrote that the Hebrew language was such that 4 or 5 words crafted well would do the work of a dozen or more in English. All right? So 4 or 5 words in the Hebrew language, if you crafted it well, would do the work of about a dozen or more in English. They were like gems, cut and polished to the highest degree. They are profound. They are compressed experiences. Proverbs are timeless and time-tested. They're endorsed by experience and observations of wise men and the mind of God as well as man. So we see all that together. Now, here are some ways. There's a fellow by the name of R.B.Y. Scott that has 7 proverbial patterns in the scriptures, all right, in the Proverbs. All right? 7 proverbial patterns. Where's my... Okay.
Is that in your Bible? You look for a marker?
Yeah. Nope. There it is right beside it. All right, so here's 7 R. Okay, I'm not going to use this green one. R.B.Y. Scott sees these patterns, all right? And this is how he describes it. 7 per, there's congruity. Congruity. Now, what is congruity? It means, here's one of the examples, all right? A man who flatters his neighbor is spreading a net for his steps. All right? So it's congruity. It's a quality of agreement and appropriateness. Things fit together in a way that makes sense. So a man who flatters his neighbor is what? Spreading a net for his steps. If you're flattering a neighbor, then what? And we even understand this. If somebody comes up to me and starts flattering me about some bunch of stuff, I'm immediately on guard because why? They're going to either want something or they're set. There you go. I like that phrase. They're setting you up for something. And again, is that not exactly what he's trying to bring out there in Proverbs 29:5? A man who flatters his neighbor is spreading a net for his steps. All right, so there's congruity, there's agreement, there's appropriateness. Then there's the ideal of contrast. Now, Now, last week we talked about the idea of synonymous parallelism, right? Where you're saying the same thing. Antithetical parallelism is when you say what you want to say. How?
You say it again.
Well, you're saying it, but you're saying it in different words.
Okay.
Here you have kind of a contradiction. Here's the idea. A sated man. Now, sated man, the King James Version means what? A full man. A full man loathes honey, but to a famished man, anything bitter is sweet, right? And that's Proverbs chapter 27, verse 7. So if you're full and you don't want to eat anything else, and somebody offers you honey, you're sitting there saying, I don't want any honey, man, I'm full. I can't eat nothing else. But to a famished man, you can give him horehound or something like that. And he said, boy, this is great. I love this. I'm just hungry. So you see, you have a contrast here. There's a contrast. Then there's the ideal of comparison.
So antithetical is opposite?
Yeah, that's the way to look at it. They make a statement, and then they'll say the opposite to it somewhere down the line. Comparison, all right, now here's one, Proverbs 23:25. Like cold water to a weary soul, so is good news from a distant land. All right, you've been weary. I've been working, I grew up on a farm in Alabama. I've been working out in the hay field, and I'd be wore slap out. I'm tired, and I just really was, and somebody bring me a drink of ice cold water. Oh, that's great. And so here's the comparison. Cold water to a weary soul. Here you have is good news from a distant land. All righty? All righty. Then you have contrariety. Let me see if I get this. How do I spell that? T-R-A-R. I-E-T-Y. Now, contrariety may be more along the line of contrast with the ideal of antithetical parallelism, but it suggests the idea of what? Here's Proverbs 17, verse 16. Why is there a price in the hand of a fool to buy wisdom when he has no sense? Now, it was interesting to me as I was studying this last week, somebody come up and asked me, didn't the Bible say it's wrong to call somebody a fool? But all through the Proverbs, you're going to see this ideal of fools over and over and over and over and over again. So it's extremely interesting. Contrariety is the state of being contrary to the proper order. So here you have a fool that's going to buy wisdom with money. And the man doesn't even have enough sense. So there is, it's contrary to what we're thinking there in that respect. Then you have classification. Classification, all right, is what are some characteristics of certain people? So they classify. For example, Proverbs 14:15, the naive believes everything, but the prudent man considers his steps. Have you ever met somebody that's naive, that believes everything you tell them? But then the prudent man is what? He's what? He's smart enough to know that I can't follow what the naive wants to expect of us to do all the time. Priority. So think about that. A good name is to be more desired than great riches. Favor is better than silver and gold. Proverbs 22, verse 1. So a good name is more to be desired than great riches. Favor is better than silver and gold. And then the last way is consequences. Some of the Proverbs are written with consequences. And we know what a consequence is. All right, so here in Proverbs chapter 29, I think it's 29. No, I'm sorry, 20 verse 4. The sluggard, what is a sluggard?
Procrastinator, lazy.
Lazy man. The sluggard does not plow after the autumn, so he begs during the harvest and has nothing. He's not making the preparations he needs, so he winds up begging afterwards. And here you hear the consequences. He wasn't working hard enough to work on that situation. So and there we go as you think about it. All righty? Any questions about the classifications? All right, the key purpose and message of the book. The purpose was to inspire a deep reverence for God. The purpose is to inspire a deep reverence for God, fear of his judgment, and ardent love for wisdom and virtue. Ardent love for wisdom and virtue. The doing of religion is stressed in the book of Proverbs. Doing it. You hear a lot of people today talk about, well, I have faith, and that's it. Well, if you don't do it, it's not going to do you any good. That's the bottom line. How many people do we have arguments with, or that's not a good word, but how many people do we get into these discussions with? They just simply believe faith is just mentally assenting that Jesus is Christ. No, you've got to do something. The book of Proverbs, when you get down to it, really teaches practical Christianity, applying it. And that's where I was talking about earlier with the ideal of wisdom and the logos. Jesus, we are so to walk and follow in his steps, 1 Peter 2:21. Well, he's shown us how to live. So we, in the same respect, look at that in that respect. All right? The Hebrew terms for wisdom, and there's three major things here that we look at. There's the word chokmah, which means wisdom. The proper grasp of the basic issues of life and the relationship of God to man as a moral agent. So wisdom is the proper grasp of the basic issues of life. Then the wisdom involved in discerning between good and evil. The wisdom between knowing the difference between virtue and vice, duty and self-indulgence. Okay? It also includes prudence in secular matters, a skill in how to handle business affairs. So actually, as we go through here, we're going to see some Proverbs that's going to talk about business. You want to be a good businessman, read through the Proverbs because it gives you some ideas. The word understanding is the word binah. It's the ability to discern intelligently the difference between sham and reality, to be able to understand the difference between truth and error, between the temporal and the longer range values that truly guides a successful life. All right. And as we start into the book in just a few minutes in Proverbs chapter 1, I'm trying to get through this to where I can do that. He emphasizes this idea. Let's go to Proverbs chapter 1 and see this very quickly. All righty. Chapter 1, 1 through 6 talks about how do we get this wisdom? How do we understand it? Chapter 1 and verse 7 is kind of the key purpose of the whole book. And so then from there on out, everything else he says after this is kind of coming back to that verse, chapter 1 and verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Now notice, he says, look at the word here, to know wisdom. And again, that's that Hebrew word, wisdom is chokmah, have the basic grasp of the basic issues of life. All right? Good and evil, virtue and vice. He says to know wisdom. And by the way, if you look at this, verse 2, 3, 4 are a bunch of infinitives. Now, infinitives are verbal nouns. So these infinitives are nouns, but they're serving kind of as a verb, right? That's what an infinitive does. Anytime you see to know wisdom and instruction, and when it starts off like this is an infinitive. So what do they want you to know? They want you to know wisdom and instruction. Now here's the word, wisdom, instruction, okay? To perceive the words of understanding. So how do I gain wisdom?
From instruction and knowledge.
Instruction, that's it. So again, we gather together and I'm trying to impart to you some of the not necessarily the wisdom, but maybe as I'm trying to teach you where this is coming from. So this is hopefully where you get wisdom. To perceive the words of understanding. Notice here the word, now I've circled in my Bible or underlined, wisdom, instruction, understanding. Again, verse 3, to receive the instruction of wisdom. And whenever you receive the instruction of wisdom, what are you going to have? Justice, judgment, equity. So again, think about that for a moment. When we hear so many people today crying out for justice, where are you going to get it? From instruction of wisdom. Where's the wisest words that we could ever read? Right here in Scripture. So that's where you want to know what justice is. Some people talk about justice. What is justice? It's a word that gets bandied about a good bit, but it's doing what's right for everybody, irrespective of race, irrespective of class, irrespective of everything, doing what's right. To give prudence. What does that word prudence mean? Is that not, in a sense, a synonym for the word wisdom? Prudence and wisdom are a lot of times used the same way, are they not? To give prudence to the simple. To the simple? Who's the simple? Well, he'll talk about them in terms of fools later, right? To the young man, knowledge and discretion. Now look at this. He says, I'm writing these things to know wisdom and instruction, to receive it, to give it. I want to know it, verse 2. I want to receive it, verse 3. I want to give it, verse 4. I want to give it to who? To the simple-minded and to the young man, knowledge and discretion. Okay? Again, discretion, the ability on how to use it. So you're trying to help the naive, you're trying to help the simple out, and then what? Then you what? You want to help the young man. What if, again, we spent more time teaching our young people what we find here in the book of Proverbs while they're young? If we drill it in their heads, if we get them to memorize it, would it not really help them as they live the rest of their lives? I believe it would. A wise man will hear and increase learning. What kind of man? Wise man. So you're going to hear and increase learning. A man of understanding will attain wise counsel. So he's saying again, and you hear again this parallelism, and you also hear the chiasmus here, don't you? You have a wise man will hear and increase learning, and a man of understanding will attain wise counsel. Are they not saying the same things there? A wise man and a man of understanding is the same man, right? What will the wise man do? He will hear and increase learning, so the man of understanding will attain wise counsel. To understand a proverb and an enigma, the words of the wise and their riddles. So all through this book, you're going to have small parables. You're going to have, as I said before, these very pithy proverbs. And all of this stuff is going to be tied in together. So here's the purpose of it. What is the purpose of the book? To know wisdom, to receive instruction, to give prudence or wisdom to those who need it. So then here's the key purpose, verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It all starts with what? A proper respect and a fear for God Almighty. Proper respect for what he's saying and what he's emphasizing. Okay? Now, I think I've given you in times past, and what I'll do is I'll try to email you some of these notes so that you will have them, and then you could add to the material on mine a little bit later on. I have an outline of the book here, but let's kind of look at the structure of the book. I never realized this until, and I think I may have referenced this last week. If I went over this last week, please forgive me. I again want to do it to where you do understand it, but it's kind of like an envelope. Proverbs 1 through 9. And if I said this last week, then you can see it's very important to me to get this idea across, right? And if I didn't say this last week, you need to get it. Proverbs 1 through 9. is a father's instruction to his son. And in this passage, he's going to talk a great deal about wisdom, and he's going to call her a lady. A lady. Now, later as we get into it, we're going to actually sit back and say, man, I can't believe he's really going into this much detail. I want to say this about chapter 4 or chapter 5. He will warn his son about prostitutes. And you're sitting there thinking, wow, I didn't know the Bible would do something like that. Now, here's the key. The ideal is, what would be a prostitute? Well, obviously, and as I've read it many times, I thought about a promiscuous woman. But if we look at it in a bigger sense, if wisdom is a lady, then being a fool or being somebody that's unwise is what? It's following a prostitute, right?
Okay.
You see the point? He tells his son, you seek wisdom as a lady. That's the lady you need to find. But watch out for these others. Now, again, I think that a lot of what he said there is very, very applicable when it comes to the actual relations of men and women and prostitutes on the street. But again, it could very well be that this is a symbolic nature or symbolic word talking about living your life without any sense whatsoever, without any wisdom, without any understanding whatsoever. And then, as you continue to look at this, it's interesting that you finally come to Proverbs chapter 31, where a king's mother is telling her son what kind of wife to have. Years ago, there was a book, and I think my wife has it. There was a book out called The Proverbs 31 Lady and Other Impossible Dreams. Okay? In other words, according to this lady, the Proverbs 31 lady doesn't exist because in real life, she can't be that way. How many women have studied Proverbs 31? How many women have gone to seminars and stuff like that where they talk about Proverbs 31 over and over and over again? Now, I want you to think about this in this respect. If, again, wisdom is a lady, could it be that, again, in Proverbs 31, he's not talking about the perfect wife as much as he's still talking about what he started off talking in the book about wisdom.
Mm-hmm. Also, doesn't virtuous mean honorable?
The what?
Virtuous, doesn't it mean honorable?
Yeah. Yeah. So, you have a wisdom and a lady. As a lady, as she's personified in that respect, then you have this perfect woman, as it was with Proverbs chapter 31. And everything from Proverbs chapter 1 through chapter 31 is the letter as it was. Proverbs 1, 9, and 31 is the envelope that carries everything. Then everything from chapter 10 all the way through chapter 31 is all the wisdom that you need to know this lady. But if you choose not to, you can choose to follow this prostitute. But, and it's interesting, a king's mother is telling her son, this is what you need to follow. Mm-hmm. Look at the Proverbs 31 lady and think about how wise she is in preparing for everything for her family and everything along that line.
Now, is this literal or figurative? Or is this about spiritual living? Or it could go either way?
It could go either way, depending as we go through there. A lot of it's going to be very literal. Mm-hmm. A lot of it's going to be, you take it on its face value and say, wow, that's right, you're right. But some of it could be figurative. And again, we do it a lot of times, but maybe not as much as the Hebrews or the Greeks did, where they would talk about figurative things to bring about what? understanding in a physical life. So even in this respect, you still have that kind of same thing going on, right? Mm-hmm. All right. So as you're thinking about it, it's an envelope. It's an envelope that contains everything else in the part of it. All right. Everything is packaged between here. Now, the problem is, again, as you go through here, we start reading through the book and we're sitting there and we're always looking for the what? The context. And when you get into the book of Proverbs, some of them are just standalone by themselves. But again, it was written for that way so as to encourage their children to memorize it. They're not going to have any connection. But we are going to find some of the passages in the book that are going to have connection. And that's why I was stating last week that a lot of times when preachers preach on the book of Proverbs, a lot of times they will do it not so much verse by verse, as much as they'll try to get all the verses together that talk about the tongue. Or they'll get together all the verses that talk about fools. Or they'll get together all the verses that talk about marriage. You know, and that's how they'll try to put it all together, which again is a good way to do it. But one of the things that I was studying and thinking about, recent scholarship does seem to think that there is more connectivity through the book than what we a lot of times realize. So maybe we need to look a little bit deeper, a little bit harder to try to find that connectedness than what we would in other circumstances. All right. All right. Proverbs are easy to remember than to forget. They're easier to remember than to forget. They are easier to remember than they are to forget, right? They do not argue, they assume. Proverbs do not argue, they assume. They're not to sit there to explain a matter in detail as much as to give it pointed expressions to it. Again, it's a matter of teaching. It's teaching. All right? Chapters 10 through 15. Now you got Proverbs 1 through 9. Chapters 10 through 15. You have a lot of Proverbs here that talks about the things, the way things ought to be. The way they ought to be. Okay? And in this section, they're going to do a lot of contrast between evil and good. Okay? Evil versus good. All right? So they'll talk a lot about evil versus good, righteousness and wickedness. The first set teaches the blessings flow from godly living. Prosperity is a result of hard work, wisdom, and what? Divine blessing. After chapter 15, the Proverbs come across with this idea that what? Okay, here's the way things ought to be, but guess what? Life doesn't work that way, right? We dream of a world, and the only explanation, the only thing we can dream of is heaven itself. We dream of a place where everybody's doing what's right, living what's right, saying what's right, but that's what it ought to be. Amen? Yeah. But now let's talk about the real world. And here it's now what? It's things do not always work out that way. So here in this section, you're going to have a lot of these kind of better, whatever, than. So now it's not so much what ought to be, but it's better. This is better than that. This is better than that. This is better than that. The righteous are not always prosperous. Chapter 16, verse 8. Chapter 28, verse 6. There are shades of gray in the world. Young people need to master the major rules of life so that whenever they deal with these, quote, shades of gray, then they will understand that that's just part of it. Life is full of absurdities. Life is full of injustice. Life is full of irrational catastrophes, right? So we've got to help them to understand that, and that's the reason, again, why I wrote the book, all right, or why the book is in part of the Bible. The theological teaching, when we use the word theological, what does that mean?
Your understanding.
Right. The word theology itself comes from two Greek words.
Isn't that the study of?
Yeah, theos.
Isn't it God word, theology, God's word?
Word or study. You have this word ology, okay, biology. It's the study of life. So theology is the study of God. It's the study of God. And again, that's why we're striving, what we strive to do here at the Georgia School of Preaching, and what we're going to continue to strive to do in all these circumstances is teach. The Lord God is the author. He is the source. He is the beginner of morality and justice. So when you look at all of this, you're going to see that idea. Wisdom is God's gift.
That's amazing how when you think about the Bible and the justice system and how everything the justice system is based upon the Bible, but then they stray away,
right,
with the same-sex marriage and all that stuff,
right, and abortion and all these other things. Yeah. And again, years ago, people would understand, this is where this foundation was, this is where it all come about. And so looking at it from that viewpoint, when everybody agreed that this is where the standard of morality should come from, then we were more at peace than what we were. That's not to say that we didn't have injustices.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, misunderstandings of Scripture, misunderstandings of what the Bible taught about slavery, kept a lot of people enslaved. Let's be honest about that. But that was also during a time, I don't want you to think about this, it's also during a time of when there was no safety net, there was no welfare, there was no Social Security, there was nothing. So slavery really, in one sense, was the way they handled everything to pay off debts. The world, by and large, tried to what? Once you become a slave, you're always going to be a slave. Exodus chapter 21 emphasizes the idea that if a brother Jew owes you some money, you can take him as a slave. But after 7 years, you got to do what?
Let him go.
You got to not only let him go, but what? Give him enough money to get him started again.
Right.
So that was totally different from what the rest of the world was, and what the rest of the world thought in that respect.
Well, we look at it from the Bible standpoint, when you go back to the Old Testament, to that there, come to the New Testament where it talks about, slaves honor your master. So we're still talking about the initial concept that was in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament it's perverted.
It's perverted because by that time, slavery was such a normal thing. I think, like I said, I had heard somewhere that slaves outnumbered Roman citizens in Rome, and so there were 60 million plus slaves. And again, and I think that was one of the biggest fears a lot of people had, was if they ever decided to raise up. But then you had the best army in the world, the Roman legions, that would squash it, just like, the whole situation with Spartacus and the whole history about him emphasizes that idea. So it goes back to what I was saying. The Lord is the author of morality and justice. And this is where we need to go get the understanding that we need to get. So what are we've already kind of looked at chapter 1, 1 through 9 or 7, right? He wants the student to know what two things? Wisdom and instruction, right? And he wants them to understand, and understanding refers to the ability to discern between good and bad, true and false, good and better. He wants students to receive the instruction of wisdom, righteousness, that which is according to the will and ordinances of God, judgment, delivery of the correct judgment on human action, and uprightness, rectitude in thought and action, dignity and integrity, morally correct thinking. All righty? So he's wanting to challenge the wise as well as the young people in this. All right? Let's stop there for just a minute. Let me get something to drink. My throat is shot, and I hadn't felt good all day. I just had a headache all day and finally got rid of that. Man, my voice is going. Huh?
Anybody online?
Yeah. Yeah.
You got it on pause?
Well, I guess I could pause it. A good idea. Thank you, brother. Thank you for doing that. Where is pause? Okay, we're back. Sorry, it took a little bit longer. I drank a lot of water, so hopefully I can, get through the rest of this class. What is the fundamental principle? Proverbs 1:7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. So there's an antithetical parallel, but it's also a contrary thing in the fact that he emphasizes, here's where you got to start, but everybody else, if you're starting anywhere else, is not going to get there. The fear of God, what is that? It's the reverential attitude or the holy fear for which a man whose heart is right feels toward God. It's not so much the ideal of servile fear, the ideal I've got to do this, but it's more of a fear of offending the Father. It is a hatred of evil and warm embrace of what is noble and holy. So if one would advance in knowledge, he must have a reverence, and that's what the ideal of reverence is for the Lord. Now, I've often thought a lot about that. My mother, years ago, never will forget this, she went to Church of Christ one time, and she said, I don't like it. I said, what's going on? And she said, well, there's not enough reverence here. It's just like everybody's just doing everything, and there's no reverence. And she had a very good, valid point, in that respect. It seemed like to her that there was just too much going on. Faith is the foundation of wisdom. Faith enables reason to connect with reality. And so that's what's important of it. So here you have the fear of the Lord, the reverential fear is the beginning of wisdom, but the fools are going to do what? They're going to go a different way. You've got the pull toward God and you've got the pull toward evil. It's simpler a lot of times just to go in with the crowd. It's simpler to follow the pull of evil because more people are engaged in evil. So fools are those who are not willing to know God despite the wisdom and the instruction that people have to tell them about God. They don't want to know him, so they're not going to try to live that way. And what is he, Psalms 14:1, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no what? There is no God. So when one's relationship with God is clear, every other relationship of life is also clear. When one fears God, he has a certain obligation with respect to his spouse, to his superiors, to his children, to his neighbors, to his friend. So as you get down to it, how does God want us to live? Well, again, Jesus would say in Matthew 22, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself, quoting from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. So the book of Proverbs is intended to do for the believer's daily life what the book of Psalms does for the devotional life. Proverbs focuses on the walk. It focuses on the walk. And so the divine plan is for a society in which people work hard, where everybody's observing other people's rights, respecting each other, treating the less fortunate kindly, a society in which people are friendly, enjoying pleasures of moderation, where they love their families and their home, a society in which people are sincere, modest, self-controlled, temperate, chaste, willing to listen and to learn. All the things that we think about America many years ago, but for some reason or another nowadays it's not, right? And the thing is again, we need to understand that Jesus is the very embodiment of this heavenly wisdom. All the divine knowledge is embodied, all the divine wisdom is embodied as it was in Jesus. In 1 Corinthians, the first chapter, verse 30, he says this, "But of him are you in Christ Jesus, who became for us wisdom from God." Now, what does it say? What did Paul say about Jesus? He became for us wisdom from God and righteousness and sanctification and redemption. So in essence, verse 30 is a sermon in and of itself, as me and Jerome were talking about a few moments ago in there, the idea of a sermon. Here it is. What do we know about wisdom? Look at
what verse are you talking right now?
1 Corinthians 1:30. Of him you are in Christ Jesus, who became for us. Jesus became for us wisdom from God. So he is the embodiment of wisdom. But we also find in Jesus righteousness. We find in Jesus sanctification. We find in Jesus redemption. Everything is found in him. So you glory, and again, we do not glory in anything but what the Lord has told us. So this is a great passage, beginning in verse 26 through verse 31. And again, why does Paul emphasize this idea of wisdom to the Corinthians in the first chapter? Because they had come from a Greek culture that placed a lot of emphasis upon wisdom. And they actually would say wisdom is the most important thing. Gain wisdom. Well, Paul is saying, okay, you've got a good point, but let me say this. All the embodiment of wisdom is found in Christ. You want to know what wisdom is, look at Christ. You want to know what redemption is, reconciliation is, what sanctification is, look at Christ. So there's so much there involved in that. All right? Again, what is our first responsibility? To God, to fear God, to respect God. That's it. And notice going on, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Go on to chapter 3. Proverbs chapter 3 at verse 6. 5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. So again, it's interesting. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. It will be health to your flesh and strength to your bones. So again, fearing the Lord provides for confidence and trust. We can trust God to be with us. We can trust God to help us in all that we're doing. Again, all the duties that we have toward God in the externals of religious worship should not be neglected. Remember, think about what the Hebrew writer will say in Hebrews 10, verse 25. What will he say? He'll emphasize the idea that what? Forsake not the assembling of yourselves together, right? As the manner of some is, but exhorting one another. We're going to find that the proverb writer is going to encourage us, like the New Testament, to confess our sins and our shortcomings. Proverbs 28, verse 13. Proverbs 28, 13. He who covers a sin will not prosper, but whoever confesses and forsakes them will have mercy. You see, that's a simple passage to memorize, right? And again, it sums up, in essence, what the Bible talks about with the idea of confession. Now, what is exactly confession?
I guess you are revealing your mistake or revealing your fault.
Right. I never realized this until I began really studying the Greek language, but it comes from a Greek word that means homologos, homologia. So you have the word homo, same, logia, or again, logia, logos is the ideal word. You're saying the same thing of God, what God already knows. Oh. Confessing is saying the same thing that God already knows about you.
Oh, I was thinking about confession like us confessing our faults.
Right, it is. That's what it is. Mm-hmm. It's confessing our faults to one another. but it's also confessing to God what God already knows. We're just speaking the same thing that God already knows about us.
Oh, okay.
That's all that, so when we confess. Now, why does he challenge us to confess? Because when we say it, we own it. Right? So God in his infinite wisdom said this is what Christians need to be doing. And so again, he emphasizes that idea that this is what we need to be doing and keeping our relationship with God what it needs to be. Sometimes God will emphasize the idea that in our walk with him, he has to chastise us. Hebrews, the 12th chapter, emphasizes the idea that you need to respect God as our earthly fathers punished us while we were here. But our heavenly Father punishes us for our good. Well, lo and behold, we find that same ideal in Proverbs 3, 11 and 12. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor detest his correction. For whom the Lord loves, he corrects, just as the Father, the Son, in whom he delights. So you see, Hebrews 12, 5 and 6 is really a quote from Proverbs chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. Do not despise the chastening of the Lord. So we have a duty to God. We have a duty to ourselves to avoid the things that would deprive us of salvation. Listen to what he says in Proverbs chapter 1 at verse 10. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. As I was doing some research on this passage, and we'll get into this in just a moment, the idea that I'm thinking about is trying to go through in detail Proverbs 1 through 9, and then we'll try to hit some of these other things and then kind of sum it all up about the middle of the course. So that's my plan. That's my goal of doing this. But he emphasizes the idea that we have a duty to ourselves to avoid those things that would deprive us of the things that are the most important. So he will say to us, Proverbs 1 verse 10, if sinners entice you, do not consent. One commentary I've read on this particular passage talks about the sin of gangsterism. Gangsters. Now, we hear a lot about that today, the gangs of New York, that movie that not too long ago. But you think about how even in our culture today, gangs are a very important thing. And most of the gangs, think about it, the Crips, the Bloods, and some of these others, most of the gangs provide family situations or a relationship with people in the gangs, but also most of the gangs are all about what? Evil. Robbery, murder, rape, all these other things that we think about. And so he's emphasizing the idea in verses 10 or chapter 10 or chapter 1 at verse 10, don't listen to the sinners when they are enticing you. That's just good wisdom. That's just good. And it's interesting as he starts this book off talking about wisdom and so forth. He says, now, son, let me tell you, let's get this straight first. Don't listen to all these thugs and these gangsters wanting you to come and be part of them that are wanting you to help rob one another or rob people and that you're attacking defenseless people. Don't listen to that. Don't pay attention to that. You do not allow that. Don't you walk, verse 15, do not walk in the way with them. Keep your foot from their path, for their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed blood. So in vain the net is spread in the sight of any bird, but they lie in wait for their own blood. So he says it takes away the life of their owners. So as you look at this, very first thing he's trying to get across here is, son, stay away from those that are doing evil. Now again, think about how in our culture today, moms and dads ought to be teaching that. My mother and father taught that to me. And so, they emphasized to me, get away from it. Don't get involved with these people because they're going to lead you down the path of destruction. And so I think because of that very simple advice my mom and dad gave me, they didn't read necessarily to me out of the book of Proverbs, but out of that very simple advice, I've made a course of my life that is totally different from a lot of other people.
I can look back, same thing you're talking about, back when I was about 12, 13, 15, around that age bracket, when you start there. My mom said, spread your oats.
Yeah.
And there were gangs in the neighborhood, and they called it drafting. They would come to the neighborhood and draft you. You have to fight to get into the gang. And as an adult, all the guys that I looked up to, they had all the girls. They dressed nice. They talked, with their swag, and all that, excited me.
Right.
But with my teaching that my mother gave me, as I grew up, I saw that a lot of them got strung out on drugs. Some of them were in jail, and some of them were dead.
Yeah.
And these are the guys that I wanted to pattern myself after, or
right.
not so much pattern, but be with.
Mm-hmm.
And our parents thought, no, oh, Mom, you don't know them, but our parents knew.
Yeah, that's right. And that's what he's trying to do in this particular passage, is emphasize that whole idea. Look, hear the instruction of your father. Do not forsake the law of your mother. There'll be a graceful ornament around your neck and chains about your neck, or head and neck. And so that's why he says, do not listen to these. Now, there's some question among some brethren, or some commentaries. Excuse me. There's some question whether or not. No, I'll try to tough it out for a little bit more time. I don't know exactly what. I think it's something I ate yesterday, and it's making me pay dearly. But anyway, where did I go? What was it? This whole idea: listen to your mama, listen to your father, stay away from the gangsters, and again, all the things that's going on along in that situation. Think about how that would need to apply today, and we need to tell our children that and emphasize that. Don't get involved in that. Think about how the world will change. I think I remember now what I was wanting to say. It's about there in Cobb County, over there in the area of the South Cobb area. It's becoming more and more gangster because it's moving out from Atlanta. It's coming right up I-20, right out there at I-20. And what they are finding is that the district attorney here in Cobb County, Vic Reynolds, gave a warning to everybody in the county, saying their initiation into these gangs involves a lot of times breaking into vehicles, stealing what you can. If you have a maybe you carry a gun, or you have a gun in the console of your car, they will steal your gun, and then to take that gun immediately and go out and rob somebody. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about that, and it's sad, at the South Cobb Church building, I used to, years ago, I used to drive for pizza delivery. And, you never know what you're going to find out there. So I always just carried a gun. I don't know, just for my own personal benefit, and I never ever got it out. I got it out every once in a while just to shoot it. That's about it. Somebody stole my gun out of my car at the church building. Mm. And less than 5, I immediately went to the police station down the road, reported it. Less than 5 hours later, they caught the guy with my gun. He had already performed an armed robbery. And I'm sitting there thinking, wow, and I felt horrible. That was one of the days that I had my mind on something and I didn't lock my car. And of course, my son, who all are police officers, well, Dad, it wouldn't have mattered if they wanted it bad enough. They just broke the window and got it anyway. But I felt bad because of the fact that I made it easier for him to do that.
Yeah.
Knowing
what was in there in the car.
Yeah. And again, what's interesting to me as I think about that is that, again, we have a duty to others to try to prevent. I guarantee you, I've locked that car ever since that day. It's a remembrance to me every day. Lock the car, lock the car, lock the car. So I do. But again, think about that whole idea of gangs and gangsterism and how that is still even so applicable today. Get away from that. Notice, again, the similarities as we're going into the text itself. He said, my son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait to shed blood. Let us lurk secretly for the innocent without cause. You remember the chiasm idea that I was talking about earlier? You have a lot of this here, right? So they're just repeating it in 2 or 3 ways. Come with us. Let us lie in wait. Let us swallow them alive like Sheol, and whole like those who go down to the pit. Now notice here the word Sheol and pit are the same words in the Hebrew. Notice the word alive and whole are the same words in the Hebrew. So again, the way that they would remember this and memorizing this particular passage in verse 12 is alive and whole, and Sheol and pit were the same words. So, if you don't have that many more words to memorize, then it would make it easier to memorize, right? So what were these gangsters doing? Let us swallow them alive like Sheol. What is Sheol? It is the grave. And whole like those who go down to the pit. We shall find all kinds of precious possessions. What are they doing? They're hoping for gain here. So we're doing this for robbery so that we could gain. It's for us. We want to fill our houses with spoil. What is spoil?
Contraband.
Yeah.
Stolen stuff.
Plunder. We think of spoil more often than not when armies go into other areas and then they just take whatever they want at that point in time. That's spoil.
The spoils of war.
The spoils of war. That's right. So he says, in essence, cast your lot among us. Let us all have one purse. You're all in this together. We're going to share and share alike. We're all going to be involved in this. And this wise man Solomon was trying to warn his son, don't do this. Now, was Solomon having to deal with gangs during his days? There's something to think about in the fact that as you're reading this whole situation and we're comparing it to our situation today, is this not really what he's been trying to say? Could Solomon, as king, have been really dealing with this issue and trying to stomp out the highwaymen and so forth that were there, the brigands there at that point in time? Could he have been trying to work with this? And maybe this is the reason why that's the first thing he really does is emphasize to his son, listen, don't get in the wrong company that's going to lead you astray. I don't care if they promise you the world. Don't do it. Because, verse 15, my son, do not walk in the way with them. Keep your foot from their path. For their feet run to evil. They make haste to shed blood. In vain. Now notice here, in vain the net is spread in the sight of any bird. What is he talking about there? What does that mean? Well, again, in the context of this idea, he said, these people, what are they doing? Well, by and large, these people are simply doing things that's going to cause them to lose their souls, right? So the ideal, as you're looking at all of this and tying it together, is the ideal of this happening. He says, you could set a net to catch birds. And he says, these sinners are the same way as the birds. The birds don't pay attention to you setting out a net for them until you catch them, and then it's too late. Mm-hmm. And that's, again, the same thing. They're lying in wait for their own blood. They lurk secretly for their own lives. So are the ways of everyone who is greedy for gain. It takes away the life of the owner. So again, as you see this, he said, what's he saying in verses 15 through 19? Here's the end result. If you get involved with these people in this way, here's the end result of it. And it's interesting to me that as he starts off this entire book, he's emphasizing the idea, stay away from the evil counsel. Now, interestingly enough, right after this, picking up with verse 20, he then talks about the call of wisdom. Here you have all these wicked people encouraging you to do this. Listen to wisdom. Listen to my words. Listen to what I want you to do. Wisdom calls aloud outside. She raises her voice in the open square. Now notice he's personifying wisdom, calling it she. So he says lady, right? And that's what I was showing you just a few moments ago. Wisdom is personified as a lady. But also, as we talked about earlier, wisdom was with God from the very beginning. We talked about that. And again, it's all summed up in Jesus. So now notice she's calling aloud outside. Why is she calling aloud? Because there's not a lot of wise people. And so she's preaching or proclaiming this message. Listen to me. I will give you the wisdom. I will give you what you need to live life. I will show you what you need to do. So she raises her voice in the open squares. She cries out in the chief concourses. Again, the chief concourses are where on top of the walls, as it was, where everybody could hear her. And she speaks at the openings of the gates of the city. She speaks her words. During that particular time, most of the things that were done at city gates. We remember reading in the book of Ruth, where whenever Ruth was married to Boaz, that Boaz met with the elders of the city and also met with that one Goel, that guy that had the right of redemption. They met at the gate of the city, and they actually did a property deal at the gate of the city where all the elders are sitting there witnessing this property deal go on. So it seems like in most of the cities at that time, that's where most of the business was taken care of, at the gates. The elders would be sitting at the gates. So you had the elders in the city, they would be sitting at the gates. Anybody that needed some wisdom, some good advice, then all the elders would sit there, tell them what they needed to do, how to encourage them. Think about the whole idea of the elders, the older teaching the younger. And again, if we did a better job at that, how, again, the world could change within a generation or so. But again, we're getting away from that. Now, here is wisdom. She's crying aloud. And so then she asks the question, how long, you naive ones, you simple ones, will you love simplicity or naivety, being naive? How long will you put up with that? Scorners delight in their scorning. Fools hate knowledge. Now notice, and again, I'm trying, as I go through here, I'm marked in my Bible, just like I did in the first part when we talked about Proverbs chapter 1, verses 2 through 6. You had to know wisdom, to receive wisdom, to give wisdom. Now here you have the same idea. Notice how she calls these different people different names: simple ones, you naive ones, you scorners, you fools. You see the contrast. He's using these. The writer is using every one of these words to emphasize, here's what you need to be watching out for, son. Listen to the call of wisdom. Don't be listening to a bunch of fools. Don't be listening to a bunch of scorners. Don't be listening to the naive ones that's going to believe everything. What does that say to us today when we talk about social media?
Oh.
I mean, there is a lot of discussion now about fake news.
And you already mentioned that. It was always fake news before they came up with the concept of fake news.
Right.
And
again, it became a situation, and I speak to myself, and you're about as old as I am, but I remember whenever I was growing up, we had 30 minutes of national news and 30 minutes of local news.
Yeah.
We always watched Walter Cronkite. He would sum up everything that was going on in the world and always end up 30 minutes after saying that, and that's the way it is.
Yeah.
I'd always like that. He'd just give us the simple facts. Now you have 24-hour news channels, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, all these others. You've got all of this, and they have to justify their job. So they talk, and they make news over nothing. And the big news that we need to know about, we don't, no, it's not there. Now, so as I'm looking at this, I'm sitting here thinking how this is so applicable to us today. The naive ones who's going to believe everything that comes down the pike, everything they read on Facebook, Everything they see on the internet, these are the simple ones, the naive ones. He says, how long will you love that? Then there's also those out in our social media that are scorning religion, scorning Christianity, scorning what God wants and what God expects. And then you have the fools. They just hate knowledge. And it's always interesting to me every once in a while, I will sit down and watch or, go on Facebook and see these guys go up and ask people questions. And it's like, they will take some of the things that President Trump said, and instead of say President Trump said it, they say, well, Mr. Obama said this. And then people just automatically all in love with it because supposedly Obama said it as opposed to President Trump or vice versa. You know what I'm trying to say? Yeah. So it's extremely interesting to me that as we read these words, think about how this is so applicable to us today and how it's so important that we really do study these things. So he says, turn at my rebuke and I will pour out my spirit on you. Now, again, I will pour out my spirit upon you. Again, we immediately think of the Holy Spirit. But again, remember the context. He's talking about wisdom. I'm going to pour out the spirit of wisdom on you. I will make my words known to you because I have called and you what? I have called and you refused. I have stretched out my hand and no one regarded. You ignored or disdained. You hated my counsel. And you would have none of my rebuke. So what does wisdom do? I will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your terror comes. When your terror comes like a storm, and your destruction comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you. Wow. Just wow. Isn't that interesting? It's wow. He said, I'm going to laugh. You wouldn't listen to me, so I'm going to have to laugh at you. Get your wisdom. Then they will call on me and I will not answer. Then they will seek me diligently, but they will not find me because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. Chapter 1 verse 7. The fear of the Lord is what? The beginning of knowledge. That's right. So, isn't it again interesting? Notice here how this wisdom is personified as a woman. And then he says, they shall call on me, but I will not answer. And they hated knowledge because they did not choose the fear of the Lord. And they would have none of my counsel and despise my every rebuke. They wouldn't listen to what I encouraged. Every time I tried to tell them to do something another way, they did it totally opposite. I remember my dad doing that to me. Son, why don't you listen to me? And I sit there and think to myself, well, Dad, you don't know. No, and now I wish, that I had. Yeah. And that's just the way it is. He says, they shall eat the fruit of their own way, be filled to the full with their own fancies, and the turning away of the simple will slay them. In other words, just by their waywardness, just by the simple, the naive ones, going whichever way they want to go, that's what's going to destroy them. Because they believe everything and don't really sit down and judge it. And he says, notice again, here you have the turning away of the simple, the complacency of fools will destroy them. But whoever listens to me who? Wisdom personified, will dwell safely and will be secure without fear of evil. Wisdom. Wisdom. We think about today the need to have safety and security, right? But here it comes. If more people would be wise, if more people would understand God's law, what God says. Notice again, going back up here, they did not choose the fear of the Lord. So what can be the solution to our problems in our society today? Preaching and teaching the fear of the Lord, helping the simple, the naive to realize that everything you read on Facebook is not true. Helping the scorners understand, okay, you're going to pay for this scorning one of these days. Helping fools to understand that you're being foolish. You hate knowledge. So you go ahead, and I've done this with my son. My dad did it with me. Go ahead and do it your way. Find out.
Mhm.
And when did they find out?
You right there.
That's right. And that's what that sometimes causes us what? It causes us to choke, doesn't it?
Mhm.
Yeah, it really does. All right. Well, let's stop there. We'll pick up with Proverbs 2. I'm like I said, I'm going through Proverbs 2 and all the way through chapter 9, and then we'll try to get everything together. Okay?
That was good.
All right.
Boy, I never knew you could get all this out of Proverbs.
Well, it fits so much today. It really does.
Yeah, when you sit down and break it down, I mean, most people just read it as the poetry of the Bible.
Yeah.
They just read and go through it,
Not thinking.
not thinking, not understanding, not taking it in. Okay, that sounds good, but what does it mean?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
What does it mean?
That's right. That's exactly right.
Man, shoot. I might take that and put something together with all that. He's going to a lot of directions with chapter 1.
Right. And again, I wish we had the time just to spend in every one of these chapters, a whole entire class time, but we can't. Not in 13 weeks. Not when you got 31 chapters.
Yeah.
But again, we just do the best we can where we are with what we got.
And you didn't even have to come out of the chapter. You didn't have to go through. You didn't have to go parallel with Rome.
Didn't have to.
You know?
That's right. You're right. You're right. Brother Byrne, glad to see you and hope that everything's going okay with you. Hang in there, brother. Again, I appreciate all of you guys so much. You're taking this class. If there's anything I can do to help you or to make this class more interesting, please feel free to let me know. Talk to you later. Thank you. Bye-bye.